Hi, Kevin.
Yes, here we go. Hello.
Hi.
That's always the first great part when we're up and we can see each other.
Exactly. Perfect.
Okay, so now here's the next thing I got to do quick here. I have to be able to bring in my PDF file, so I'll have my photos. And once we have that, we should be okay.
Awesome.
Let me see. I guess we would do. I should be able to just slide it in. Let me try something real quick. Let's see how I'm going to do
Okay,
it.
take your time.
Let's see. Record, share, chat, participants, share video. Let's see. All right, I'm going to try something real quick here. Okay, let's see. That's not it. Go back here. Okay. Let's see if I can. Let's see how I'm going to do this here. Wait a second. Share. Not doing the video. This will probably just take a minute, but we'll get it. Share screen. Let's see. Oh, wait a minute. If I put this down in the smaller screen, hold on a second. Let me do this here.
Sorry. Hold on.
Sorry, no problem.
Hey, Bill. Bill. Just so you know, keep this here changing out the protein thing. Sorry about that.
No, don't worry. I'm playing with this for a minute.
Okay.
Have this. Just trying to figure how to get it up on here. Hold on.
Let's see, all panelists. Does that work?
Hold on. Let's see. So I'm looking because normally I could just drag the PDF and it goes right in.
And I've now given you the option to share your screen.
Okay, so let's see how this works. Give me a sec. Wait a minute. Okay, so here we go. So here's my. Give me a second here. Oh, okay, so it should be this one. I'll take this. I got to just slide that in here. Let's see how we do that.
And now over to Kevin.
Great, thank you, and welcome everybody. And tonight I am going to be covering the history of art and culture in New York City. And what we're going to be doing is, when most people think of New York, most people will agree that we're considered the cultural capital of the world. So I'm going to be explaining a little bit tonight on how that happened and how that came into an existence, and who are some of the people that either the artists or people who started museums, because tonight we'll definitely be focusing in terms of culture. We're going to be looking mostly at art history. So when I say the cultural capital of the world, of course, there's other things that are part of that, like the Philharmonic, the opera, and other things. But again, I'll be focusing mostly on art. And definitely, please, at the end of the presentation, ask as many questions as you like. So I'm just going to jump right in. Now, when you look at 400 years of New York City history, if we were to go back to the beginning, when Europeans first settled here in the 1620s, that would have been the Dutch. And when they settled here, they called Lower Manhattan, it was actually New Amsterdam. And unlike other colonies that were being set up in the Americas here, this had nothing to do with religion. This had nothing to do with political freedoms or anything else. This was purely set up as a business venture. It was actually the Dutch West India Company that set up this settlement of New Amsterdam. And basically, for the next 200 years, from the 1620s to the 1820s, that's more or less the main focus of what's happening here in New York City. It's a place to do business. It's a place to come to reinvent yourself. But again, it's mainly focused on business. You would never use the word New York and culture in the same sentence because that just didn't exist in the first 200 years. Even when the British had control, it was the same way. And even after the American Revolution, when George Washington was sworn in as first president here in New York City, even then we were not a cultural capital, or we didn't have any culture whatsoever. If you were looking for anything along those lines, you would want to go to either Boston or Philadelphia. It's decided that this is not going to be the capital. George Washington will only be here for about a year. Then the capital is moved to Philadelphia and then eventually Washington, D.C. And that basically frees New York from becoming a capital city. And now we can continue to focus on the business of doing business. And New York City is going to continue to grow and prosper throughout the 19th century. But again, still, there's nothing in terms of culture or any kind of art scene. Now, this painting here, this is what New York looked like before the Civil War. This is after the Civil War. By the 1880s, the Brooklyn Bridge is now opened and we're now connected to the city of Brooklyn. And this is when things are going to start to drastically change. There's going to be a feeling in New York that we felt that our money and almost a showing off of it would get respect, mainly from Europeans, but that was not the case. We were still kind of looked down upon because America itself was sort of looked down upon in terms of culture, but definitely New York because it basically did not exist. But this is going to start to change because after the Civil War, we're going to see one of the greatest explosions of wealth in all of humanity. Now, as you go back through time, there's always been great wealth, but usually that was in the hands more or less of emperors, kings and queens, pharaohs, and usually people connected to that. And whatever you were born into, that was probably going to be your life. Meaning that if you were born wealthy, you would have been wealthy, your children would have been wealthy, but everyone else was more or less locked out of that. But that will change drastically in the Gilded Age. This is one of the first times where a majority of the people in any particular country had a real opportunity to become very wealthy and climb the social ladder. Now, this is actually Fifth Avenue. You are looking north, the tallest building on the left, that's Peninsula Hotel. Just in front of that is the University Club, and towards the end of that street is Central Park. I just wanted to give you your bearings of where you are. Also, you see three vehicles. There's a horse and carriage on the left, horse and carriage on the right. Dead center, by the way, that's one of the first horseless carriages in New York, one of the first photos of an automobile in New York City. Now, for the most part, this incredible wealth that's being made, people are now starting to collect art, but they're only really displaying it in their homes. So if you were going to see any kind of art, you would have to either know the Vanderbilts, the Astors, or one of the wealthy families in New York to be invited to their homes to see their artwork. So basically for the general public, there was no place to see art at all. There were literally no museums in New York, no art museums. There was one museum, which I'll tell you about in a moment, but there were no actual art museums. Now, the only other place that you might be able to actually see some art would have been in some of the private clubs in New York. There was a big private club scene in the 19th century and the 20th century and the 21st century. But again, you were probably part of that upper class. You would have had probably a mansion nearby. So you might have been able to see art in some of the private clubs. But again, there was no place to go see this art. Just another photo I just wanted to show you. So again, if you were invited to somebody's home or one of these private clubs, you might have had an opportunity to see some art. Now, some of these great mansions that were being built up along Fifth Avenue, some of this great wealth, there were those that now the kids or even the grandkids of some of these original people that made this wealth, ones that would be traveling throughout Europe, were starting to take an interest in art and maybe wanted to learn how to become an artist. But one of the problems was there was no place in New York to learn this. There were no real art schools yet. And again, if you were trying to see art, you would have to be invited to somebody's house. So this is one of the Vanderbilt mansions, by the way. I just wanted to give you a photo just to show you what this looks like. This looks like one of the galleries in the Louvre in Paris, but no, this was actually right on Fifth Avenue, and this is one of the Vanderbilt mansions. And again, it would have been very rare for the average person to ever be able to actually see any of this in person. Now, the first group of people that are really going to help to change this, sorry about that, the first group of people that are really going to step forward to really change this here in New York are some of our first, well, they would call them robber barons of the day, but the first real big business tycoons in America, the people that really led the charge during this Gilded Age. People like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt. Now, by the way, apart from J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie came from a very poor family when they lived here in America. John D. Rockefeller actually came from a somewhat poor family. He failed several times in business before he made it. He would actually be one of the wealthiest out of all these people, by the way. If you were to adjust what John D. Rockefeller had, what he was worth to today's dollars, depending on who you talk to, it's anywhere between 300 and 400 billion dollars. So just think of someone like Bill Gates or somebody today. That is like triple or quadruple what our richest people have today. And keep in mind, back then, there's no income tax. So it's going to be people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, Vanderbilt that are going to start to invest money, not only in bringing art here to America for people to see, but they're going to be some of the first to start investing to build museums to actually show some of this art. J.P. Morgan in particular is going to help to found the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I'll get to in a moment. But it's not only just Rockefeller, Morgan, and Vanderbilt, but it's also their children and grandchildren that are going to take their great fortunes and reinvest that in New York. And one of the things that I'm really focusing on tonight are people that are and artists that were New Yorkers, either people that were born and raised here in New York or those that moved to New York from somewhere else and consider themselves to be a New Yorker. Even today, I meet people that are in their 70s that have spent their entire life somewhere else. They moved to New York, they're here for a few years, and they consider themselves a New Yorker. And that can happen. So there is something about when you live here for a little while, you can consider yourself a New Yorker. So that's really what I'm focusing on. So all the people I'm talking about would have made a lot of these fortunes here and even more importantly, spent these great fortunes here. And again, I just wanted to give you a look at, this is Fifth Avenue, that's Central Park on your left. I just wanted to give you another look of this period of time and the Gilded Age. And again, at this moment, most of this artwork would be actually in these mansions. Now, J.P. Morgan would be the first, and I'll get to him in a moment. Now, I said to you just a little bit earlier that there were no museums, there was zero. I do have to give credit to one, though, the New York Historical Society. That is very much is a museum now and a library. People like myself, I do a lot of research there. So this is technically the first museum in New York. This actually opened up in 1804, but you would not have another museum until the Metropolitan Museum of Art until 1870. So I just wanted to say something about the New York Historical Society, because again, most people will look at the Met as being the first museum. This technically is, but for what we're talking about in terms of art, it's really not until the Metropolitan Museum, which this is actually the first building built. This was partially paid for by J.P. Morgan. One of the architects on the Metropolitan Museum of Art, their first building, was Calvert Vaux. He was co-designer of Central Park. So not only did he help design Central Park, but he would actually design the first Met building. It was an immediate success when it opened. Again, it would be the people like J.P. Morgan that are not only helping to build the building, but they're the ones that are stocking with artwork. One of the things to keep in mind in the Gilded Age, America was on the rise. You were having all these new millionaires, which today we'd call them billionaires. Whereas in Europe, a lot of people were losing their money. A lot of it was because in Europe, you had this generation after generation handing down these great fortunes, but they were getting less and less as time went by. So in Europe, a lot of people were somewhat desperate to actually sell their artwork because they were trying to keep up a certain lifestyle. So in America at the same time, we're making the money. So people like J.P. Morgan would send buyers over to Europe to buy the artwork at a very reduced price. This is the first of many expansions of the Metropolitan Museum. If, for those of you that know Central Park, if you look to the left of this photo, that's Cleopatra's Needle. This was actually the main entrance to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was assumed you were coming up from Central Park or you were coming up Fifth Avenue, and the Cleopatra's Needle was supposed to be a way to sort of pull you in, and that would be the entrance to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And as it starts to expand, by the way, as the buildings get bigger, they keep gobbling up the old buildings. You might recognize this. This is the same exact shot. So if you look at that staircase, when you walk into that entrance and look at those three big archways, this is the same spot. The museum would expand. This is now the Petrie Court, Sculpture Court. Just wanted to show you where that was. And again, the museum would expand again. The building on your right is probably what you are more familiar with. And again, this is mostly private money. And I can't stress that enough, that one of the things that was happening here in New York, that this money that these people were making, a lot of these people were from other places originally. People like Carnegie made a fortune back in Pittsburgh, but they were actually spending the money in New York. I just wanted to give you another photo of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And now we're going to come up to our first artist that I'd like to talk about tonight, Florine Stettheimer, born 1871, died 1944. She was born in Rochester, New York. She's an American modernist painter, theatrical designer, poet, and she came from an extremely wealthy family. She had 4 other sisters, but when she was very young, her father actually abandoned the family. Her mother would actually continue up the lifestyle. She actually got X amount of dollars from that husband that left. But the point being is that she came from a very wealthy family, and the mother decided to spend half the time in New York and the other half in Europe. When Florine was a young girl, she was actually developing a real interest in art. She was actually seeing a lot of art while traveling throughout Europe, and she was actually taking art classes in Europe. The reason I mention that is because this was unheard of. If you came from a very wealthy family, especially if you were a woman, you would not be encouraged to follow that path. You were expected to be essentially a socialite. I hate to say this, it sounds terrible, but you're just basically you went to finishing school to basically learn how to throw a proper party. But that's one of the things that's so important about her family. Her mother instead encouraged her and nurtured her curiosity in art. Now, she would move back to New York and she would start to develop her own art style in the way she would draw and the way she would paint. She was known to paint in real blazing primary colors. That was one of the main things that she was known for. But also one of the things that she would do is that most of the paintings usually would have family members in it. So all the way to the left, that's Florine. There's 2 of her sisters. 2 of the other sisters did get married. And there's her mother sitting in the chair, the yellow chair. And basically they would spend the rest of their lives together. Florine, her 2 sisters would never marry. And the mother, they would all actually share an apartment. They would buy a massive apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan on 76th Street. It was apartment/studio. And she also had another art studio down by Bryant Park. But not only was she known to paint in blazing primary colors, but she featured her family and friends, but also scenes of New York. If you notice in the top left, that's the Chrysler Building. So what's happening is that the artists in New York, not only are they being inspired by living and working here, but the city itself is developing an image, because when people start to see this artwork, they start seeing New York in a different way, a more glamorous way. So this is one of the many people, which I'm going to discuss tonight, that would start to help New York benefit in many ways. So not only are the artists benefiting from being here, but so are the city itself. Now, this is a look at her studio, an apartment. Now, one of the things that she was known to do, which was unheard of in New York or anywhere in America, she used to have these salons that were very common, especially in Paris. It's a very common thing in Europe, especially in Paris. So she would have these salons in her apartment where she would invite over other fellow artists, people like Georgia O'Keeffe, for instance. She would also invite over musicians, writers, poets, dancers, and members of the avant-garde. This was really important because, again, we never had anything like this in New York. We never had anything like this in America. So this is really the beginnings of us, not so much at the moment passing or surpassing Paris, but we're getting up to that level. But also what her parties were known for in her salons is that it was very open. New York City was becoming a very progressive city. And what I mean by that is people that came to these salons, whether it didn't matter what their sexual orientation was, it didn't matter if you were gay, lesbian, bisexual, it did not matter. People felt very open to be who they were. That was unheard of. That's really important to keep that in mind. So New York City started to become this place that other people around the country knew that no matter what their sexual preferences was, whatever they thought, they knew they could go to New York and just be themselves. We take that for granted today, but this is the beginnings of that. And that's one of the things that's going to help New York thrive. She's going to be known, some of her most famous paintings, by the way, are the cathedral paintings. They're all based on New York City. This one is Broadway. So this is actually during the Great Depression. So what this painting does, it's showing Broadway in the theater district in a very glamorous light. Dead center, that's Mayor Walker. He was the mayor in the late 1920s. If you look just all around the photo, people getting out of the limo in the bottom left, you see on the top right, it says the Roxy. It shows people out and about on the town, in the theater district, in Times Square. And it helped give New York this sense of glamour. So even though we were starting to suffer from the Great Depression, it gave people a different way of looking at New York. This particular painting is called Art. So what she's doing is she's looking at the art world. So in this painting that she did about the New York City art scene, top left, it says the Museum of Modern Art. The center there, that's supposed to be leading into the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In the painting itself, which, by the way, she usually would always put herself in the paintings. I don't want to tell you where she is in every single painting. This one I will. She's at the bottom right. So she'd always put herself somewhere in the paintings. And in this particular painting, it's a gathering of art critics, dealers, and photographers of the day. So again, in one way, it's really glorifying sort of the scene, but in a little way, kind of poking fun at it. If you see that person laying on the floor in the bottom center, being attacked by those photographers, they didn't even have the word paparazzi back then, but this is just kind of playing around with it. So it's very interesting. But this is what people outside of New York would start developing an image of what this city is really all about. All four of these paintings, by the way, and every person I'm talking about tonight are all in our museums. So I want to make a point that everybody watching would be able to go to one of our museums to see the artists and paintings I'm talking about tonight. All four of these paintings are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, if anybody is interested to go see them. They're all very detailed, and you can really take your time kind of looking at it. It really says a lot about New York City. Now, she actually went to school at the Art Student League of New York, Students League of New York. Now, this is an extremely important school. Now, first off, architecturally speaking, by the way, I just want to throw this out there. This is Henry Hardenborough. He's actually the same architect who did the Plaza Hotel and the Dakota Apartment building. He was actually hired to do the art to design this building. This was founded in 1875 by a group of artists, almost all of them who were students at the National Academy of Design in New York, and many of them were women. I keep saying that over and over again because you got to remember, this is a time, the late 19th century, even in the early 20th century, you know, women were still fighting for the suffrage movement was still roaring, so to speak. Women were still fighting for the right to vote. So to actually be part of this and help to start something like this was pretty incredible at the time. Their motto was founded by artists and supporting artists since 1875. So people like Florine, this is where she'd get her education. The underlying principles, by the way, set by the League founders have remained the same. And I just want to mention this because this is important. It's emphasizing the importance of artistic creativity. This is the opposite of what they were teaching in Europe. In European schools, you were being taught a certain way to do your art. Think of like European masters, for instance. Think of like a Rembrandt. When I showed you Florine's, that's the total opposite of that. Very bright, very colorful. So one of the things about the Art and Student League here was you are free to be who you want to be. It's not degree based. It's based on what you can do. There's no art 101, so to speak. So it's just a great place to go, and you're encouraged to develop who you are as an artist. No place else like it in anywhere in the country at this time. And it's really important because it's going to pull people into New York City to want to live here and work here. Some of the people that went here that shaped their careers: Norman Rockwell, Georgia O'Keeffe, Jackson Pollock, Augustus St. Gaudens, and on and on and on. So this is a very important part of how the art world was developed here. This just gives you a look at what the actual classroom looks like. And again, if you notice, there's mostly women here. And we're going to get to our next artist. This is actually Edward Hopper. I'm going to get into him in a moment, but I just wanted you to, when you look at this, right away, this is a New York City street scene. He's going to really help to shape New York's image, again, throughout, not only for other New Yorkers, but throughout the rest of the country. This is actually Edward Hopper and his wife, Josephine. I wanted to have a picture of both of them because I don't think she gets enough credit. She was actually a very respected artist in her own sense, but as his career was rising, she kind of stepped back to help him as his career was rising. So she sacrificed her own career to make sure that he would be successful. She was also the main model in most of his paintings. So whenever you see an Edward Hopper painting, if you see a woman in the painting, most likely it's her. She would also help to market his work, in other words, to help promote him. And she would also help to name some of his paintings. And whenever he was kind of feeling down, so to speak, she would always be there to sort of lift him up. So I just wanted to mention her because she's extremely important. Now, Edward Hopper was born in upstate New York, in Nyack, New York. He was very influenced by his town, but more importantly, by his parents. His parents were very nurturing, and they really, really pushed him to do what he wanted to do in terms of art. Again, very unheard of in those days. Most parents would say you should go to school, go to university, become a lawyer or doctor or anything along those lines. So to encourage your son to go off into the art world was unheard of. They would actually buy him art supplies and what have you. He actually studied at the School of Art and Design here in New York. That eventually becomes the Parsons New School of Design. He actually had taken many trips to Europe, and he had the same feeling as Florine did, that instead of doing what he's being told to do in Europe or trying to copy the European masters, he would do very much the opposite in terms of color, in terms of subject. Now, what Edward Hopper does, he gets a lot of his inspiration from the city itself. Around 1913, he'll move to Greenwich Village, spend almost the rest of his life there. He would have his art studio there, and he would get a lot of inspiration from the city. This is called the theater. This is one of many of his famous paintings. I just want to point out what he had done. He went around to many different theaters in Times Square, some movie theaters, some regular theaters, and wanted to get the look, the feel of a New York City theater and paint that. That woman to the right, that's his wife. That's the model that she modeled for him in their apartment, and then he kind of put her in the painting. And one of the things I just want you to notice is the use of color and shadow. And also, and I'm going to mention this again in a moment, most people will talk about Edward Hopper and say that most of his paintings are about loneliness and isolation. Just to let you know, he himself would say that's not necessarily true. And he himself said, my artwork is what you think of it. So I just want to give you a perfect example. When you look at something like this, she's an usher. What I see is somebody who just worked very hard to get everyone to sit down. The movie started. She's kind of taking a break. She's kind of relaxing and getting ready to go back to work when the movie is over. So again, I just want you to think about that when you see any of his works, that a lot of it is what you really think of it. And I actually, just personal opinion, but I think all artwork, one of the best ways is you look at it, I think, again, this is my personal opinion, is kind of take a look at it first before someone tells you what it's supposed to be about. But there's no better example of that than Edward Hopper. Another perfect example, and again, These are artworks that become famous that really show New York City in a different light, literally a different light. Look at his light and shadow in this painting. And again, it's what? It's just some guy sitting in his office. It's just a couple of 5-story walk-ups in the painting in front of him. You wouldn't think it's such a glamorous scene, but that was just it. Hopper was trying to paint everyday life in New York, and this is what people around the country started to see New York as, that even everyday New York scenes could be something of beauty. Again, loneliness and isolation. For any of you that works in an office, I see a corner office with 2 giant windows with 2 different exposures. And I see a guy here that's just taking a moment to enjoy the view and just kind of sit back and say, wow, I got a great office. So again, it just depends what you think. But again, this is one of his other famous paintings. Painted bridges and the waterfront. And again, this was romanticizing just something as dirty and dingy as you might consider the waterfront to be at this time. Something as simple as rooftops. You know, you talk to a lot of people throughout the country. There's something about our rooftops. You see it in movies, you see it in photos. Before any of that, before it was in the movies and photos, you're seeing it in these kind of paintings. So again, I would think that I know that actually some Hollywood directors would get sort of influenced by these types of paintings. This is what they would think New York would look like, and this is something they would eventually try to capture on film. This is obviously one of his most famous. It's called Nighthawks. It was actually titled by his wife. She made up the title. We don't know exactly which diner it is downtown. From my research, it seems like it's more of a composite of several different diners. It's just a simple city scene late at night. And it's just taking something so simple as a diner and New York and making it seem interesting. I don't see loneliness. I don't see isolation. I just see late at night that people were probably happy, realizing, wow, in New York City, they have 24-hour diners, you know, and the woman there and the man sitting together, maybe they just met, maybe they know each other. The guy behind the counter, he seems friendly. The point is, it's getting the image of what New York City is like out there to the rest of the country. Moving on to Gertrude Whitney. And by the way, tonight I'm going to try to squeeze in as many people as I can because there's a lot of people to talk about in general, but I just want to get in as many as we can talk about tonight. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. The key word here, by the way, is Vanderbilt, which I'll tell you about in a minute. She's a sculptor, art patron, collector, and founder of the Whitney Museum of Art. She spent a lot of time traveling the world with her family. She came from a very, very wealthy family. Again, it's the Vanderbilt family. And one of the things that she did when she traveled around Europe, she became very inspired by the museums and a lot of the, not only artwork, but sculptures she would see around Europe. And she really wanted to do this. She was very fortunate that her family supported her. Again, if you were a Vanderbilt, you were expected to toe the line and sort of, again, have sort of these cocktail parties and these big balls, but she was able to sort of go out and do what she wanted to do. And her great wealth was able to help her do that. So she could go out and she could actually help support the arts, which is extremely important. This was her studio and museum for some time. She actually also had an apartment upstairs. And one of the things that she did is that she supported and exhibited a lot of women's works and women-only shows. Again, I keep saying that theme over and over again, but it's very important in New York. And she was a big supporter of women artists. She also studied at the Students' Art League of New York. Again, a lot of important people came from there. She also saw American artists with new ideas had trouble exhibiting or selling their work. So that was one of the big things that she wanted to do, is that she wanted to begin to purchase people's work and also to help show their work so they could sell it. So this is one of the things that she was doing in her studio when she founded the Whitney Museum of Art. This is actually the second building. The first one was downtown, what I just showed you. This is the second home to the Whitney Museum. What's very interesting is she did actually offer her entire collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they turned it down. And not only was she going to give them the art, she was going to actually pay to build another wing at the Met to put that art in. So they didn't do that. So they ended up building their own building. This was on the Upper East Side. It is no longer the Whitney. They moved downtown. The Frick collection, for those that know the Frick Museum, it's closed for the next 2 years. They're doing a renovation and expansion for the next 2 years. Everything from the Frick will be in here. Very interesting. It's a brutalist style building architecture-wise, so it's interesting to see that collection there. The Whitney Museum did eventually move further downtown. And again, I think New York City is a better place because of what she did and what she was able to accomplish in New York. It would have been very interesting to see if she would have been able to do that somewhere else. Now, some of those other people I was talking about from the Gilded Age, when I mentioned the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan, there was also Henry Frick, who was a partner in Carnegie Steel. He was basically pretty much what we'd consider a billionaire of that day. He was a big art collector, and not only art collector, but decorative arts, furniture. I mean, he collected everything you could possibly think of. He didn't do it by school, meaning that, he just basically collected, he just bought whatever he thought looked good. And he wanted a place to showcase the art really for himself. So when he hired the architectural firm to build this building, Career in Hastings, they took it upon themselves, knowing what a big collector he was. And I do want to point them out. That's actually Henry Frick. They're the ones that would actually build his mansion in a way that he was able to show his art, again, to himself. They did not know this. His daughter, and I have this painting here because that's actually his daughter. In Henry Frick's will, he let his wife stay in the home until she died. And then the daughter, who's in this painting, was to take over the mansion and convert it into a museum. So she deserves a lot of credit for that. And so does the architectural firm. I wanted to mention them because the architectural firms here in New York are very important for showcasing a lot of our art, because a lot of times their buildings themselves are a work of art. This is Career in Hastings. Some people sometimes ask me for some from books about certain people. That's actually a great book on that architectural firm. But again, the fact that they knew, oh, by the way, Career in Hastings, they were actually building the New York Public Library at the same time that they were designing Frick's house. So that shows you the kind of wealth that Frick had, that he can hire these architects to build him a home while they're actually doing the New York Public Library at the same time. Again, they would design the home, not knowing that it was going to be a museum one day. So it's laid out in a way that you'd walk through it. This is Henry Frick's home. They actually built an art gallery for him. This would just be for him personally, for his own personal use. And again, it was great for the daughter when she took over everything, because everything was pretty much ready to go to turn the home into a museum. And Henry Frick left this in his will on purpose as basically a gift to New York, which again, it would be important that he decided to live here and to spend his money here and develop, because now that New Yorkers were able to go to a museum like this and see some of these great European masters, it would actually help New York grow as an art capital, because the more people that know about the art, the more people become interested in art, the more people might buy art, and so on and so forth. So it kind of fuels itself in the industry. Other people did the same thing. This is J.P. Morgan Library. This was his home, and he actually built an extension to the home to have his collection. If anybody has a library in their house, I've always fantasized to have a library like this, but he knew he had intentions for this, again, to eventually be open to the public. So we have J.P. Morgan to thank for that also. And here's another shot of the Frick house, but again, having this open to all New Yorkers to see and visit is pretty incredible. Our next family is the Rockefellers. Now there's the oldest man there. That's John D. Rockefeller himself. He made his $400 billion fortune in oil. He did a lot of charity work later on in life, started a lot of institutions, but really the person I want to talk about is standing behind him. That is Rockefeller Jr. Now, you might know him. He was actually responsible for building the Rockefeller Center. So Rockefeller Center was developed by him. Two of his sons, Nelson and David, were responsible for building the World Trade Center complex. And the Twin Towers used to be nicknamed Nelson and David after the two brothers. One was the governor of New York, one was the head of Chase Bank, and they actually put the World Trade Center complex deal together. In this photo, you see those three boys on the bottom. You see the girl to the right, and then you see John D. Rockefeller, the older man. Next to him is John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s wife, Abby Rockefeller. I'll tell you about her in a moment. And then those other two boys there. Those five boys, by the way, would do a lot in the future for New York City art and culture, which I'll get back to in a minute. But again, there's John D. Rockefeller, but even more important would be his wife, Abby Rockefeller. Abby Rockefeller was a big collector of modern art, basically. And her husband, John D. Rockefeller Jr., wanted nothing to do with it. He didn't want to spend any money buying any of that kind of artwork. And he just was totally against it. She kept pushing and pushing and pushing. Not only was she buying the art, but she wanted to co-found. She was one of the co-founders of a museum to show this art. He more or less let her do what she wanted to do. And then it got to the point where they needed a place to actually open the museum. So their home was actually on 54th Street. If you look at this photo, that's the sculpture garden at the MoMA. If you look to the left, you see all those mansions on the block. At the end of the block there, that's the University Club. They had a mansion just like that where that sculpture garden is. Because basically when John D. Rockefeller asked his wife, so where are you thinking of putting this museum? She says basically where our house is. And he says, what are we supposed to do with our house? And she goes, we're going to have to move. So they ended up moving to an apartment on Park Avenue. They tore down the house, and that's where the MoMA was built. It's expanded many times throughout the years. But the next time you're in that sculpture garden, that's where the Rockefeller Mansion originally was. And again, this idea of buying this modern artwork, this contemporary artwork, and promoting it and having a place for people to exhibit this work was very important, because she could have put this museum could have been put just about anywhere. But again, wanting to have it put in New York was very important to the Rockefeller family, and it would be very important to the city of New York. Rockefeller brothers, all the way on the left, that's David Rockefeller. Second from the right, that's Nelson. The man in the center is the person I'm going to talk about just for a quick moment. I don't think he gets enough credit what he did for culture in New York. That's Rockefeller III. He was the one that spearheaded. He's the one most responsible for getting Lincoln Center up off the ground and seeing it through to completion. I've done lectures on Robert Moses. He was very important for that. The president of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, broke ground on this place. The mayor was for it. The governor was for it. Leonard Bernstein was for it, but it was really Rockefeller who really pushed it through. He's the one that brought all these people together to get this done. So we got a new opera house. We had a new place for the Philharmonic. There was a lot of talk about tearing down Carnegie Hall. So this is why the Philharmonic wanted to move. We also didn't have a proper place for the ballet company, which is on the building on the left. But also there's other things part of this complex most people don't realize. There's the Juilliard School. A lot of people come here to go to school there. There's also a theater, a Broadway theater in the complex that was built at that time. Also, in order to be actually listed as a Broadway theater, you have to have more than 500 seats. If it's $4.99 or less, it's off Broadway. And if it's $99 or less, that's considered off Broadway. So this theater is actually in the complex, is a Broadway theater. It's more than 500 seats and can be up for Tony Awards. But again, that does a lot for New York. This is this whole complex is one of the things that's going to cement New York's place as the cultural capital of the world. There's actually a film institute here and all sorts of other things within the complex. But I wanted to give sort of a thanks to the Rockefeller family, because again, it was Rockefeller III that really had seen this come through. And of course, his mother is the one I just talked about, Abby Rockefeller, who started the MoMA. Here on the left, we have Frank Lloyd Wright, and on the right, we have Solomon Guggenheim. Now, Guggenheim he came from a very, very wealthy mining family. During the Gilded Age, you look at the families, the Rockefellers were oil, Carnegie was steel, J.P. Morgan was banking, and their family, the Guggenheim family, was mining. So where did they get all the raw materials to make, like, steel and other things? Well, there was the mining family. Solomon himself was a big art collector. He originally collected masters, European masters. That's what he was really into. While in Europe, he was exposed to European avant-garde types of art. And all of a sudden that lit something up inside of him that he started to become a collector of that type of art. And as his collection grew and grew and grew, Solomon realized that he needed a place to put all this artwork. He originally used to use his apartment in the Plaza Hotel as a museum, basically open to the public, that if you made an appointment, you can go see his artwork. He started realizing this might not be the best thing to do, to have just strangers coming into my apartment. So he starts coming up with the idea of actually purchasing some land and building a museum. So interestingly, they were looking at sites all over the city. They even looked at some sites in the Bronx. He actually decided to build it on Fifth Avenue across from Central Park, mainly because Solomon believed that it was better for the art viewer to sort of calm yourself before you walked into a museum. So the idea is having Central Park right there. You might be walking through the park on your way to the museum, or even if you get out of a taxi in front of it, seeing the park is supposed to calm you and put you in a better frame of mind to go in and experience the artwork. Unfortunately, Solomon died about 10 years before this whole project was completed, but at least he had put the money up again to get the building built. He had his collection to kick off the museum, and he still had Frank Lloyd Wright working to complete this building. Just a view of some of the art. Oh, I'm going to jump back for 1 minute. Sorry about that. Unfortunately, Frank Lloyd Wright actually died 6 months before the museum was opened. So Frank Lloyd Wright would have seen it like this, but he never actually saw it completed. Interestingly, if anybody knows the Guggenheim, it's a white, somewhat off-white building. The original designs, it was supposed to be pink. That was the color that Frank Lloyd Wright wanted. Solomon was fine with it. When Solomon died, and then when Frank Lloyd Wright died, the board and I think a lot of the neighbors put some pressure on to say, I don't think the building should be pink. Why don't we make it white? And that's why the building is white today. And we're going to move right along here to Edith Halbert. Now, she was one of the first female art dealers and the woman who championed many American modernist painters for her 4-decade career. Now, this wasn't the Gilded Age. Now we're getting into the 1950s and 60s, but still, for a woman to be so powerful and so dominant in the art world was unheard of. So she was a real trailblazer in what she did in terms of the art world. One of the big things with her also is that she helped establish the Downtown Gallery here in New York, and she put a lot of energy into the promotion and distribution of artworks to both wealthy collectors and to museums. So she would help basically, what would you call it? Consulting. That's what I do too. I consult in terms of history. But she would consult museums about certain artwork to purchase. So give an example, Abby Rockefeller would purchase paintings from her. She would give her advice what she should buy. And a big thing with her is that when she created this dense network of connections throughout the city and through the art world and connecting artists, again, with dealers and with museums, she really focused on overlooked 19th century American production, as well as the works of folk artists. And she really helped Americans appreciate American art. The reason I'm making that point clear, everyone, more or less, in the art world looked down at American artists and American art, including Americans. It always had to be some sort of European artist or an artist from somewhere else. So she's one of these people that really helped to make, again, American artists and what they were doing valuable and make it part of the conversation. That when you talked about things in the art world, you had to talk about these artists and what they were doing. And again, things like folk art stuff. So she helped really bring this. Again, she was in the business for almost 4 decades. She studied at the National Academy of Design and also was a member of the Whitney Studio Club here in New York. The reason I say that's important because we notice all these things are connected. These schools that are opening, the people that are opening the schools, the museums, this is helping to foster and help lay the foundations for the New York City art scene to really grow in New York. And this is what's really building us up to becoming the art capital of the world. She was also very progressive in her exhibition policy. She focused on diversity, basically, I mean, from the artist's point of view. So if you were, didn't matter what you were and what your background was, if you were a woman, an immigrant, didn't matter your religion, if you were Jewish, if you were Catholic, if you were an African-American artist. So she gave a great exposure to most artists that normally would not get that because of, again, the color of their skin or their religion. She was one of the people that helped to break down a lot of those barriers, and she was doing that here again in New York City. Jumping up to a little bit more of modern times, some of us might remember him, Keith Haring. He would take a totally different type of art. Some people consider it graffiti, which for most, if you think about the 1970s, if you see some of the old movies from the 1970s, people spray painting or drawing things on subways or subway platforms was considered taboo. People wanted to get rid of it. People looked down upon it, but he would take this to a whole new level. This is actually one of his most famous works. Not only was his work shown in museums, but he did a lot of public work. Now, there were a lot of artwork outdoors because he felt that everyone should have a chance to see this artwork and not necessarily have to pay to go to a museum, or even if you couldn't get to a museum. This was up in Harlem where he did this. This is actually at 128th Street and 2nd Avenue. So for anybody that's driving into New York City, when you come over the 3rd Avenue Bridge into Manhattan and you're cutting over to 2nd Avenue, you have no choice but to make a right turn to go down 2nd Avenue, and you'd be heading through Harlem to the Upper East Side. You can't miss this work. It's right there. That's him on the bottom left painting it. And it wasn't just that he was painting or doing this artwork with no meaning. He was actually putting a lot of meaning behind a lot of his artwork. So back in the 1980s, there was a big crack epidemic. So he was trying to get a message across too, that it was not just something to look at, it was something for you to study and hopefully get a good message out of it, a positive message. And he also brought a lot of attention to AIDS awareness. And unfortunately, he actually did succumb to complications from AIDS, but he was a big advocate for AIDS research, and he did a lot of work for that. And his work still lives on here in New York City. Again, you would get the image of the 1970s. You would think of a graffiti. You would think of our subways. Most people thought of this in a negative way, but thanks to the art community, they were making it seem positive in a way. Now, there's a certain amount of art to graffiti. Maybe just spray painting anything for no reason, maybe not quite, but a lot of it, believe it or not, people did take time, and it is considered an art form today. And this is one of the things that he was trying to drive home with his artwork while he was alive and doing his artwork. This gentleman here, Guy Wilgis, New Yorker, born and bred, went to school here in New York. He was an American Impressionist painter. And his thing was, he was actually born in Brooklyn. He was born in 1883, lived to 1962. Again, an American Impressionist. But many of his paintings, which, by the way, he went and studied at the National Academy of Design, again, keeping talent, bringing talent, and keeping them in New York, having these schools here are very important. What he would do through his Impressionist paintings, American Expressionist paintings, he would take ordinary scenes of New York and through his paintings, glamorize it in a way. So something as simple as a scene of just some skyscrapers and the boats spewing off some pollution, as you can see in that painting, those boats on the river, he was showing a certain beauty to that. He was taking an everyday scene that millions of New Yorkers would experience throughout the year, just commuting back and forth, maybe from Brooklyn, maybe from New Jersey, something as simple as a commute. Through his paintings, he would make people see things in a different way. Again, it would be sort of not only just glorifying, but taking just a regular scene of New York, like this one. Especially, a lot of them were done in the winter. A lot of us right now are dealing with the winter weather. A lot of people might think negatively of it, but he was doing a lot of his paintings in the winter. And again, this sort of gives you a sense of almost like it's a movie, or it's sort of like a dream painting, but this is a real painting. You're actually looking at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. To the left is actually a Gilded Age mansion. It's one of the Duke mansions. It's actually, a little side note, it is for sale and it is intact. And throughout, the Duke family had it throughout most of their lives. It was handed down. It's mostly intact. It's almost impossible to find a Gilded Age mansion completely intact to the way it was back from the Gilded Age. So it is for sale. I'm hoping somebody buys it and maybe turns it into a museum. It's perfect for that. If anybody wants some ideas on anything, or maybe a group you want to get together and buy this, it's just ripe for again, hopefully it's a museum. I hope an individual doesn't just move in there. So it's right across from the Met. It's right on Museum Mile. But again, his paintings, the idea of bringing a new way of looking at New York, taking something like a cold, snowy day that most people would not think of as a positive thing. He was romanticizing it. And he was getting this inspiration from New York. He was a very talented painter. He became very well known at one point. He could have gone just about anywhere and lived anywhere, but he wanted to be in New York. He saw a beauty in the everyday, and he really wanted to paint that and give people the impression of what New York looks like. This is Wall Street, dead center on that. That's Trinity Church. To the left of, just left over, you would have the headquarters for JP Morgan, New York Stock Exchange. To the right of this painting, that's George Washington. That is actually the actual spot that George Washington was sworn in as first president in 1789. And what was known as Federal Hall that used to be on that spot, that was the first US Capitol. The Congress and the Senate were all in the same building. The Senate was upstairs, Congress was downstairs. That's where we get the term upper chamber, lower chamber from. And everybody was in there, including George Washington. That's where our Capitol was. But again, they would decide to move the Capitol out of New York. But getting back to Guy Wiggins, again, he really helped to shape the way people think of New York City. Getting up into more modern times, I just wanted to explain that when you went back to the Gilded Age, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and this incredible wealth that people had, and starting these museums and helping to start these art schools and encouraging artists, giving them an outlet to sell, to paint, to exhibit their artwork. That this is not something just of the 19th and early 20th century. This continues today in the 21st century. I think it's important to point that out. This is along Museum Mile also, which, by the way, happened kind of organically. They call it Museum Mile. It just happened as time went by. More and more museums opened up along this little stretch. It's become the big destination for a lot of people looking to see museums. If anybody knows Estee Lauder, the cosmetic company that was started by Estee Lauder, her two sons, Ronald Lauder and Leonard Lauder, they actually, they're billionaires themselves. And the reason I point that out is because with that great wealth, they actually, as very young children, they weren't even adults yet. They weren't even working yet. When they literally, like, getting their allowance, when they could scrape together a little bit of money, the both of them started buying little things that they could. I think Ronald Lauder said he had bought some sketches somewhere. And again, literally nothing, like something that was like $50. But they got a lot of inspiration because they spent a lot of time as kids going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, going to the MoMA, and that really sparked an interest in them for art. The reason I'm saying that is there's a lot of people like that in New York, but it's important to know that by going to these places, you never know what you're going to spark in someone's imagination. And with this great wealth, as the years went by, someone like Lauder bought this mansion. And again, instead of just moving in, he turned the mansion into a museum. This is the Neue Gallery. Little side note, Mrs. Vanderbilt used to live here. I showed you a slide earlier of one of the Gilded Age mansions that I showed you the interior with all that artwork that I said looked like the Louvre. That's actually where she lived. That was one of the largest mansions in New York. It had over 100 rooms. When her husband died and the money was sort of distributed throughout to her children, she was still very wealthy, but she had to downsize. So she sold her home and had to move into this mansion. She always hated this mansion. She called it a gardener's cottage. She thought it was way too small for what she was used to. Thankfully, this gardener's cottage is still here, and now it's a museum. Again, I just want to point out, because I recently, one of the biggest gifts that the Met has ever received was from Leonard Lauder. Most of his, I think almost his entire Cubist collection of paintings, Picasso's and other paintings in this collection. And it's a pretty amazing gift, because they say that it's worth over $1 billion, all the artwork that he gave. But I just wanted to point out that in the 21st century, here we have New Yorkers that were inspired by the art world, and they're still giving back. And the list is endless. There's so many New Yorkers. We have the greatest concentration of millionaires and billionaires in the world, and they give back. It's great to see for those that live here, those that are visiting here. I also wanted to mention also that when you think of New York City and artwork, what is actually seen, it's not just all in museums and galleries, but what's out on the street. This is the Public Art Fund. This is right at Central Park at 59th Street. What's great about this is that this particular spot, 59th and 5th, this is just when you're walking in the Central Park. This changes every year, which is great. So every year you get to see a new art exhibit out there. This one is called Doors for Doris, which is still there now. It's named after and in honor of Doris Friedman, who was one of the co-founders of the Public Art Program. So she's one of the, and it's celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. This was a partial way back in the 1970s when we were experiencing some really bad financial times, and the city was looking rather rough around the edges. The idea of having public art out and about the city, it was in a way to enrich New Yorkers' lives, but also for people that are visiting or working here, just to be passing by art. The idea was supposed to enliven the city and hope to spark some interest in you walking by. A very good program, again, the Public Art Program Fund here in New York City. And I'm going to end here with the Met, and I'm going to, I want to open up the floor for questions in a moment, because I want to make sure that I can answer everybody's questions. Just a little side note on the Met. It's over 2 million square feet. If you were to lay the Empire State Building down, it'd be almost the same length of the building. It does contain almost 5,000 years worth of art. So it's pretty incredible. It's an encyclopedic museum. And a little interesting statistics I love to tell people when I take people on tours of the Met is that if you were to spend 1 minute looking at each object in their collection, stand there and look at it for a minute, go on to the next object, everything in their collection from the minute they open to the minute they close. You did that 7 days a week, it would take you 5 years to see everything. And that's just one museum. And again, we have an endless list of museums. Anybody feel free to email me at any time and give you a nice list of museums, because everyone that I had mentioned today in our talk, you could actually go see their artwork in one of our great museums. And on that note, I would like to thank everybody. And I would like to open up the floor to questions on anything dealing with the art world or culture in New York.
Great, Kevin. Well, thank you so much for a fantastic presentation. I truly could listen to you speak for hours on end, and I feel as though I always learn something new. So
Thank you.
many thanks for your talk this evening. I do have a couple questions coming in that I want to start off with, but I am going to just ask more of a personal question for a moment for you. So my question to you to kick it off is, why didn't the Met want the Whitney art collection? I have to say I'm biased. It is the Whitney Museum is one of my absolute favorite museums in New York. So I'm happy that they didn't take it, but I want to know why they didn't want it.
For the most part, is because a lot of it was American art and contemporary art. And that was not popular at all. So in other words, they looked at anybody that's sort of, the funny way to put it is anyone that's alive that's making artwork, is it really worth anything? And especially because a lot of these were American artists. It was American art. It was still at a point, I'm not saying that everyone at the Met felt this way, but the general feeling was, do we really want to take this big collection? Sure, we can add another wing to the museum. We don't really think people are going to have an interest in this. That's really what the feeling was at the Met, that they just didn't think people would have an interest in that. So that's why Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, decided, okay, then I'll open up my own museum. And again, we have another museum now in New York because of that. But that's really the main reason why. And a little quick side note, it's one of the things that Leonard Lauder said, that why he gave all that collection to the Met, because he said he wanted to catapult them into the 21st century in terms of modern art.
We have another question about the Whitney Museum here. Do you know who the architect was for the Whitney? It reminds me of the Getty with the large blocks, both. And I think I'm going to expand it one step farther, the new Whitney as well as the older Breuer building.
Okay, so Breuer, that was the architect. And it was a brutalist style of architecture that was popular for a short time, late 60s, 70s. So Breuer, he was the architect of that museum. It's one of the greatest examples of brutalist architecture in New York, is that building. So definitely, I said it's actually opening in 2 weeks with the Frick collection. You can actually go see the building. The other one downtown, the new one, is Resino Piano. He's one of the, make a list of the top 10 great architects right now, the big architectural firms in the world right now. It would definitely be Resino Piano, would be in that top 10. He also did the expansion of the Morgan Library. So if you go down to the Morgan Library, that extension that they did, they connected all the buildings of the Morgan Library and Museum. That's Resino Piano. And for any Columbia University people, the expansion of the Columbia's campus on 125th Street. If you go down 125th Street, all those new buildings that are being built for Columbia, that's Resino Piano also.
Great. And another question, throughout the presentation, you spoke a lot about architecture in the city. And in previous talks that I've heard you give, you've talked about kind of the move to designate a lot of these buildings for landmark status, first as the exteriors, but then kind of the move to the interior as well. Can you briefly speak about this movement of preserving architecture in this city?
Right. Okay. So definitely, we are definitely a city. You go back to the Dutch, you build a building that's 2 stories. The British come around, you're building buildings that you rip that down, you build something 4 or 5 stories, and then years go by, you build a building that's 10 floors. And as we went, we're constantly a city of tear down and build, tear down and build. It's a small island. So that's how we grew. Everyone knows the Empire State Building. That's where the original Waldorf Astoria was. So they tore down this incredibly beautiful Waldorf Astoria. They tore that down to build the Empire State Building, right? But it got to the point in the 1960s where they said, well, wait a minute. We just lost Penn Station. Maybe we shouldn't have done that. Maybe it's better for the city to have a place like Penn Station. Places like Carnegie Hall, they were going to tear down Carnegie Hall. People said, wait a minute, maybe we need to keep that, right? Grand Central Terminal, same thing. So there was a movement and a push to save our buildings in New York because we felt like we should preserve some of our history, and that in the long run, it's better for New York. I totally get if you're a real estate developer and you own that piece of property and you're told you can't tear down that building, and you're like, well, I want to, totally get you would understand that I want to be able to build a bigger building to well, you make more money. It's just common sense, right? Luckily, with our zoning laws, we've changed it. Originally, it was a couple of pages in 1916. Now it's thousands of pages, our zoning laws. So you can actually now transfer air rights. And I don't want to go too much into that, but the point is that if you have a piece of property, you might be able to sell the potential air rights. There is ways to develop around it, and in most cases, keep certain buildings that are probably worth saving. That was just the building. It wasn't until the 1970s people didn't realize they were only landmarking the building, like let's say Rockefeller Center. Radio City Music Hall was closed in the late 70s. They didn't think it was making enough money. They were going to gut out Radio City Music Hall, all of it gone. The largest Art Deco theater in the world, gone. They were just going to add some more offices in there. There was a push to save it, and they did. It became the first interior landmark in New York. Because now we realize that maybe we should save some interiors. So a lot of the Broadway theaters, that's a perfect example. You landmark the theater, you should maybe try to landmark the inside also. But the same thing with our museums. So some of these buildings, some of these structures that are being built, people are saying, well, wait a minute, let's say the Met Breuer or the Breuer building where the Whitney was, right? It's a brutalist architecture. That's part of the design. If you just kind of ripped everything out inside or covered things up, it takes away from the original intention of what the building was supposed to be. I mentioned the Guggenheim. Imagine, it is landmark, the outside. Imagine on the inside if everything was gutted out and everything was changed. It was completely different and they just put in floors. And you didn't have that spiral staircase anymore, right? It'd be a completely different museum, right? So this is something that, for the most part, most people agreed with. And even people that didn't, there's been a way to try to work with people to make everybody happy. And I think overall we're a better city because we're saving landmarks, exterior and interior, but also letting the real estate industry hopefully thrive. You want them to thrive also. So that's where we are with the landmarking.
We have another question here. Do you have a hidden gem where to see art that we might not know about? And with that, I want you to also speak about, I know when you spoke about the World's Fair, you talked about that great kind of model of New York City. So that's the one that jumps into my mind. So if you could perhaps speak about that as well as any other hidden gems that
the Francis Tavern Museum. So it's not so much the tavern, but upstairs it's a museum to like the American Revolution, that period of time. They have quite a few paintings, you'd be surprised, and artwork. So it's something you look at, Francis Tavern Museum. The New York Public Library, the main branch on Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street. There's many of the rooms there that have artwork. There's Gilbert Stuart's and others there. So believe it or not, going into that is to look around. There is the NYU has it's their School of the Study of the Ancient World. I do believe it's 85th Street. It's definitely between Madison and 5th. Again, it's part of the school, but on the ground level, they actually have rotating exhibits there. So that's worth seeing. NYU Study of the Ancient World, that building. The Solomon Club down on Fifth Avenue is another great place. They have a lot of great artwork. Boy, oh boy. And if you're able to go to any of the private clubs, if you know anybody at any of the private clubs, usually most of them throughout the city, they have a pretty good art collection in most of the private clubs throughout the city also. And please feel free to email me and I can always give people a little bit more of a list too, but that's a few of them that are the hidden gems. I said the New York Public Library, you never think about it, but there's some great artwork in that museum, in that library. Mm-hmm. Oh, and the question about the World's Fair.
Yes.
That model, it's one of the largest models of a city anywhere in the world. It was built for the World's Fair, 64, 65. It's literally a model. It's in this giant room. I don't remember how big it is, X amount of thousands of square feet, this huge room with 100-foot ceilings. You go into this room. It's a model of all 5 boroughs, and every building in New York is represented in that model. So you're standing there looking down at a model of all 5 boroughs, and every building is there. So if you live on the Upper East Side, or you live in the Village, or you live in Brooklyn somewhere, you can point and see, you can find your building. And they do it when you walk in. They have it looks sunny, like it looks like it's a sunny day, and then they have it turn into the night, and it's got a night look to it. It's one of the most spectacular things you'll ever see. It's called the Panorama of New York. It's at the Queens Museum in Queens, and that was the site of the old World's Fair. It's definitely worth going out there because it's not just the model, the museum is there, there's a lot to see there. If anybody has seen that Martin Scorsese documentary that's on Netflix right now with Fran Lebowitz, one of his newest projects, they actually go to that place. So you can actually go on Netflix and see, they actually do a little piece there at that museum.
Wonderful. So if we don't have any more questions, I think we're going to wrap it up for this evening. I did include Kevin's email address in the chat box for everyone to see. So I truly appreciate. Ooh, oh gosh, we have a number of other questions. Sorry that I missed here. So a couple more. What New York families today are donating art for public view?
Oh, boy. Well, I know money that goes into museums, like the Bloomberg is a big contributor, but not the artwork itself. Leonard Lauder. I mean, some of the families that are actually today, Lauder was the big one. That's a good question. I'd have to really think about that, like to actually give you names of some of the families. But a lot of our museums are still getting donations from all over the place, from all over the country. Actually, you'd be surprised where they're donating to our different museums or artwork.
So a couple more questions here that I just saw come in. I think the question for that building up on that's right across from the Met, how much is it? The Duke Mansion, I believe.
Oh, that's a good question.
Somebody wants to buy it.
All over. Oh, that'd be great. All over the place. I've heard 50 million, and I've heard up to 100 million.
I saw 8 million somewhere, but yeah.
Yeah, so you'd have to check on that, but it is intact, and it's stunning. And by the way, that museum, that building, that's Career and Hastings. That's the same architects that did the Frick and the New York Public Library, and it's spectacular on the outside and inside. I forgot how many fireplaces, 20 fireplaces. I mean, it's spectacular. If somebody does buy it, please, even just the first floor, turn it into a museum or something that people could at least go in. Coffee shop, something.
And speaking of those great mansions on Fifth Avenue, we have a question about who lived in the Neue Gallery before Miss Vanderbilt.
The Miller family. That was one of the families that lived there. He's actually one of the families that helped to originally get it built. It changed hands a few times, but the Miller family was the original family that actually hired Career and Hastings to build that building. So that's Career and Hastings, again, the architects that were hired to do that one also.
Great. And also another one, what do you see as the next big artistic movement in New York City, and who will be behind it?
Who would be behind it? I'm not sure, but I do see a better appreciation for, I mean, modern art, of course, is always big right now, and it's big for a long time, but for some of the older artists that people didn't realize. Give you an example, Gilbert Stuart. He was one of the people that painted like the founding fathers, Washington, Hamilton. Well, why? Well, Hamilton's very big. People love to play. People are getting into that period of time. So who are those painters? John Trumbull, Gilbert Stuart. So there's a greater appreciation for the older artworks from America and Europeans. Like we're starting, I think, at least people that I'm with, it's not just the stuff that we're seeing today, the modern art, but people are getting a greater appreciation for other centuries, from the Dutch period, from paintings that were done in Amsterdam, like Vermeer and stuff like that. So I do see people looking back because there seems to be a greater interest in history these days. Again, thanks to something like Hamilton, people are starting to look back. So that's what I think is going to become more popular. I think we're going to start to see, again, like Gilbert Stuart. Some of these people have these paintings in their house. They don't even realize how important this guy was. So some of these older painters that were popular in their day that maybe people don't know about today, I think some of that's going to come into fashion.
Mm-hmm. And I think even for myself, what we've been seeing with our clients is it's an appreciation for the older art, but then also kind of looking forward with the globalization of art creation, the democratization. I think the ability for anyone to create art and put it out there through various platforms has really allowed artists and movements across the world, in New York City, to become appreciated, represented in the New York City galleries. I think that's a whole other talk for us to have, is about the development of the gallery scene in New York City and the support of local artists, emerging artists as well. And then I think perhaps one question to close it out, just to merge a couple together, just about how the museums have fared during COVID, and what do you see as, your thoughts for reopening and the long-term impact it has on the New York Art scene.
So no doubt, every industry in New York has been affected by COVID, right? So focusing on the museums, remember, they were closed. Everything was shut down for months. So of course, that was devastating to all the museums throughout New York because you lost all that revenue from people coming in, right? Thankfully, most museums were allowed to reopen with limited capacity. So opposed to, say, where the restaurant business is really having really big issues because they weren't really allowed to, they were open and they were closed, they were open, they were closed. At least with the museums, they've been able to open somewhat. People are going. And I think the big thing with, I think that everything will come back. I've actually given a whole big lectures on just about everything that's like past pandemics and other issues in New York City history. Literally every time in 400 years, the city has always come back bigger and stronger than ever, including 1918, 1919, the last worldwide pandemic. Guess what happened after that pandemic? The roaring 20s in New York, right? I do think all the museums will come back, but it's going to take time. There is a pent-up desire to go visit these museums, and hopefully there'll be people, I think there definitely will be, those that maybe weren't as affected financially that will donate because the museums need it. I mean, they are, I'm sure what we're going to see, late spring, summer, there'll be fundraisers, there'll be parties, there'll be events. I think that's what we're looking at. I think we just need to know that every museum in one way or another was suffering a little bit or a lot. And that together as a city and as tourism comes back and as the locals go back to museums and hopefully from donations, I think the museums will come back bigger and stronger than ever because we've literally done that throughout our entire 400-year history of the city. But even the museum scene, no matter what was happening, World War I, World War II, our museum scene, our museum, our art, our culture always came back. And I think that'll happen here too.
Fantastic, Kevin. Well, thank you again. I think that's all the questions that we have here. And as I've mentioned, I have put Kevin's email address into the chat function. So be sure to send him your questions. He is such an extraordinary resource of knowledge for all things New York. So please do reach out to him, and hopefully next time you're in the city or you want to walk around the city with Kevin, he is still doing small group private tours in person. Yes. So as you want to get out, stretch your legs, perhaps after the snow melts a little bit, he is doing the walking tours still.
Yeah, the company is still doing walking tours, private tours with me, and also consulting work on just about anything with 400 years of New York City history and events like this. So feel free to reach out to me anytime.
Well, thank you again. Again, from my colleagues and myself at Butera Art Advisory, as well as Bjorn and his colleagues at AltaView Advisors, thank you again for joining us. I know we ran a little long, but again, so much to talk about New York and the art and cultural scene there. So again, we could go on for hours, but I will end it at this time this evening. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.